Hello, everyone. Hope you have enjoyed your break. It is my first time here in Romania, and I've been greeted very well with very warm people, so thank you for that. For the session today, I have a catchy title. It appeals to your attention on the negative side, maybe, and we had the VP of EPAM also with something on that line saying, why do people hate solution architects? So I try to catch the same vibe for you. So what we're going to talk about today is about cloud migration and cloud modernization in the perspective that sometimes things work in theory, and then in practice, things might not work very well. If you were 10 or 20 years ago, we would eventually say, everything is nice, everything will work well, but you've been there for sure. So clouds have been here for a while. AWS, where I come from, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, and some others that are also looking at this business. So what I'm going to do today is I will try to represent these providers from the cloud. I am from AWS, so you will see some examples of that, but the language will be very generic. I'm pretty sure you will be able to apply that to the clouds that you work with. One or multiple or even on-prem is almost the same thing. OK, then let me get the clicker here. And what we see typically is this very nice journey where you go from assessment, understanding what's going to need to be migrated, and then mobilize, getting everyone together and getting the message right and the idea right. And then we move on to either cloud native, let's go do the modern stuff, or we need to migrate all these legacy applications and data to the cloud, and then we decide to modernize there. Once we get there, we are in the sweet spot where we can take advantage of the concepts of the cloud to then constantly reinvent ourselves. The truth, or the reality, is a bit different. What we have is, especially in complex IT systems or complex IT departments, we have something like this. So there's a bit of everything. Not everyone is in the same stage. You might have already some departments running their workloads on the cloud, experimenting things, while you have people with mainframes, you have people with SAP workloads and stuff like that, which are really hard to modernize. So how do we deal with this? Sometimes things work, sometimes things don't work. When you have such a complex environment, it is important to have some sort of framework. It is important to understand roughly the outcomes that you will need from each step, and to verbalize, to communicate that strategy to everyone so that everyone knows which direction to take. If you build this framework, you can apply it to any cloud, to any journey, to any workload. Of course, not all outcomes, not all steps will be required for each migration, but we will work on understanding which ones make sense. So imagine a set of outcomes that you need to deliver for a migration. You might need a business case. You might need someone to support it after you migrate. You might need all of those things. So what we're trying to do here, and what we are going to do over the next slides, is to understand how can we basically put some lines on those dots and create a path that we can take in order to achieve success. OK, how do we do that then? It all starts with a compelling reason. For example, you might have a data center exit, or you might want to modernize because you have a competitor trying to modernize as well, and getting better results, being more agile than you are. And some of you might remember, I try to forget, something called COVID, the pandemic, where we had this compelling need to move to the cloud, right? You still remember that, or you're trying to forget, but we all kind of do. So once you get that compelling reason and the favorable conditions, of course, some of the companies that were working already remotely when COVID hit, they were better prepared. Eventually, they moved faster, or they knew how to do things and didn't change much. So having these favorable conditions also help to kick off things. Once you have kicked them off, then, what you want to do is rapidly assess what needs to be done. if you are the one that if your company is the one wanting to migrate and you reach out to a cloud provider, typically what they will try to do is try to get from you what is the inventory. So which servers, which applications, databases you have on-prem, or on another cloud, or on your private cloud, or whatever. So whatever you want to migrate to. Then understand what are the dependencies of those. Understanding the dependencies is relevant to know, can we actually migrate? What can we migrate first and then later? So what is the map of dependencies for that? And then establish the baseline. So what do we have right now? Why do we want to change? Is it slow? How slow? How many users do we have? How much do we want to grow? Why isn't it achieving the performance that we want? So getting those baselines will help us sell the idea of the migration to other stakeholders. And after we migrate, reassess if we hit success. So what is the definition of success is what we want to achieve. Once we have that, we can then try to achieve the migration scope. Okay, let's look at everything that we want to migrate. And for that, if the clicker would work closer or further away. So once we have that, we want to establish the migration scope. And typically what we do is an MRA at AWS, might have different names with your cloud providers, but it's basically migration readiness assessment. How ready is the company and the organization and the teams to move to the cloud and be modernized? This is typically an exercise with a set of questions where we pull in stakeholders from different departments and different interests. We pull them in and we ask them, okay, where are we? How are we ready to move? Are the people ready, for example? We get these insights, and with these insights, then we can think about the technical validation. So what we want to do, is it really possible? Okay, will it achieve those outcomes? And this is where you pull in the solution architects from the cloud providers and from the partners with experience on your ecosystem to see if things really work. And then you have the cost estimation. At this point, it's just roughly estimate from that inventory how you can move to the cloud. We will add other direct and indirect costs later. But for now, just trying to understand and compare solutions with the cost estimation. And some of you might have seen this diagram. This diagram is the 7 R's of potential migrations. This is to give you an idea that migration does not mean the typical lift and shift that we talk about, which is just take whatever is on-prem and put it on a like-for-like on the cloud. It has different perspectives. So some people decide to do the migration with a replatform, just change the underlying architecture, not the architecture, the underlying platform's service that is underneath it, but still using the same protocol. Others might decide, okay, let's just refactor everything. Let's do it from scratch. We're going to do it right. And that carries a risk as well, and quite an effort. You're moving cloud, you're moving processes, and you're moving the code, changing everything. Sometimes you can just decide to, let's get rid of it. It's not necessary. This is when we retire. What we're going to do on this exercise today is try to take a path of least resistance, where we take the steps that are easy and then move on to other easy steps. When we look at the whole journey, we will have refactored our applications, but we're doing this step by step to make it easier for everyone. So this is the conclusion that we will get to. Okay, so we have the migration scope. Everyone knows what it will be migrated. Everyone knows roughly the cost. Now we have to decide if we really want to migrate. We want to migrate if the overall cost to the business, not to the IT, to the business still makes sense. What does it mean, the whole cost of the business? This is where the TCO, or total cost of ownership, comes in. How much am I spending on people that are maintaining my servers? How much am I spending on air conditioning, on energy, on security? So those are the indirect costs of what I have currently on-prem. But also, if I move to the cloud, what about licensing? What about other providers? So what are the changes in my organization? So we have to take all of this into account, and then look at funding programs. There's a lot of funding programs from the cloud providers where they are trying to convince you to move to the cloud. So understand them, take advantage of them, and add them to the total cost of ownership. Once you have all of that, we now want to understand from a business perspective if this still makes sense. You might decide that you don't want to move your 50, 100 applications that you have on-prem, many of them redundant. You might have different geographies, different countries with similar software that do the same thing, but they're all different. If you're moving to the cloud, why not aggregate all of them in a single solution that is horizontal to all geographies, that you can use for everyone, and is simple to maintain? So this is where you look at the capability model. A capability model is kind of a table, but from the business perspective. What do they need as services? They need a CRM, they need an ERP, they need a file system, and this is where you think, okay, I have 3 or 4 applications here that are file systems. Why don't I replace everything for just one single application? This is important for the business, not so much for the IT, because the IT could just lift and shift, but the business might want this and might be less expensive than doing the whole thing. So with all of these inputs, then, you have a business case. And when I say business case here, I'm now meaning the people that will sign the check, the people that will agree on the migration, that will understand the impact of the entire organization and changes of processes. You are convincing them. So you need this business case, and you need this perspective from the business. OK, so we have the business case now. We just want to kick off the project. How do we do this? The idea here, and before we go, let me just say, the idea is when we sell the kickoff to everyone, so we'll gather everyone in a room and say, we're going to migrate, and this is going to be fantastic. So we will achieve innovation velocity, we will be better than everyone else, and we will reduce costs. It's a nice message, but a bit of a dangerous message here, because in reality, if we zoom in, things are not so straightforward, especially in terms of cost. It is true that when we move to the cloud, we can reduce costs, but it's not a straight line. It's more of a bumpy ride. So what will happen is you will migrate something, and the team that is doing the project, they still have data on-prem, they need replicas on the cloud, they need extra environments to do this. So the cost will actually increase, not decrease. So you have to be careful when you send the message saying the cloud is cheaper. It's cheaper on the long run, but on the short run, prepare for a bumpy road. A bumpy ride, okay? Make sure this is well understood by everyone. Otherwise, you might have people coming back to you and saying, oh, you are not very true to us in your assumptions, and now we have exploded our budget. I've seen this so many times. Make sure you don't explode budgets by having this buffer right in the beginning or every time you do the migration before you do the cost optimization, which we will see. We'll get into the detail on that. OK, so you want to kick off. What do you want to do before the kickoff, before telling everyone that we're going to migrate? You want first to get the check or the credits or whatever, get the benefits from the cloud providers. Again, cloud providers are here to try to convince you to move to the cloud, and they understand these bumps in the road, and they have programs to soften the bumps, saying, for example, okay, we know that you will spend 20% more, 50% more during this migration, so we will cover for that. Make sure you add the buffers by signing these agreements with AWS or the cloud provider. Then you have the stakeholder buy-in. Make sure everyone in the room understands the message that you are delivering. Remember that compelling event? Make sure it's there when you present it. We're doing this for a reason. This is the why. We're starting with why. You've heard about this for sure. And then the partner selection. Selection in the sense that you need to know who's going to do the work, right? And when we are talking about who is going to do the work, there are several options. We can either do it ourselves, with our team. We can ask for professional services from AWS or for the cloud providers that you're working with. Managed services as well. So these are typically teams within the cloud providers that will do the operation for you. And finally, you have the partner network. Lots of people that are already working with you or you can work with. There are a few other options. Consider all of these. Consider training and getting everyone involved. And consider as well just mixing and getting the best outcome. OK, so we have kicked off our migration and modernization project. We call this phase the assess phase. and typically takes 1 to 3 months. From here, we want to mobilize people. We want to make sure that people know exactly what they need to do, and the teams are organized, and we're going to start doing things on the cloud. So what we need to do first, get the architectures right. Put the SAs in the room, your SAs, solutions architects, and the solutions architects from the cloud providers. Get those diagrams, get those technical validations, know what it will look like in the future. Then we have the landing zone design. Landing zones are the set of accounts and network configurations and security configurations. So all of the configuration that needs to be connected to your network, to your security rules, and where the workloads will land. So you define this, and this might be very static for quite a long time. So you need to do this one right. The cloud providers help you a lot on this. It's something that it's hard to do, but it's done only once. And then you have the migration plan. So we've collected the dependencies from above. We know how things depend on each other. We also know which teams are going to work, we are going to work with, and the resource limitations that they have, so we can have a migration plan. That's what we're going to do. From here on, we need now to experiment the technology to create a group of people that actually knows what they're doing internally within your organization. So enable this group of people that are able to enable others that are force multipliers. We typically call them Cloud Center of Excellency, or CCOE. How do we get this group to grow and become very proficient on this? Number one, we do a hackathon. Just get everyone in the room and see what you are able to do. Or a POC, proof of concept. The idea is to see how far people go. We also have some fun workshops, probably you've seen, like game days and immersion days, which are not so fun, but immersion days that look like hackathons, or hackathons with something that you need, or these proof of concepts will help to assess who knows whom, who are your heroes, who are your specialists already on the cloud that you need to implement. And then assess the skill gaps. Okay, who actually needs more help? And the entire organization, what kind of training will you need to do? And that's where you get the enablement plan. So the enablement plan with the skills gap assessment. Cloud providers also have these skill gap assessments. They work with you to identify what needs to be done in terms of certifications, training, in-class training, game days, immersion days, all of these things, and workshops to get people going. And you will have created this Cloud Center of Excellency, this group of experts that will be the force multipliers for everyone else. And from here, they will then establish the security rules and the landing zone rules, the network, for everyone else. They will be the guardians of these internal rules that everyone has to adhere to. And they will also add another layer on top of that. So the workloads, how will workloads be deployed? How will workloads look like for containers or for serverless or VMs? So these are the architectural patterns. And the idea is to simplify the life of someone who comes after. Then they can automate those patterns by creating infrastructure as code. So here I'm talking about Terraform or CDK or CloudFormation. So the kind of tools that allow you to script the architecture or script the resources so that you do this automatically and so that you can use guardrails when you're looking at the code before things are actually deployed. So the summary of all of this is called Service Catalog, which sometimes is Confluence page, a wiki page. Sometimes it's actually a service where you have blueprints and you can pull those blueprints and have authorization rules, limitations on who can use them, where can they use, manage exceptions, all of that. So it can be something simple or it can be something quite complex. From here on then, you want to go live. So we're still in a situation where we're not sure, we haven't tested nothing completely, so we want to go live to actually test for real. How do we do it? First, data replication. We know we have data somewhere, history data, if we're not on a startup, and we need to replicate this data. There are multiple ways. You can do it via the internet, or you can use mobile storage, like Snowball on AWS. my suggestion is think internet first. So before you consider any option, just find a way to move that to the cloud, to an S3 bucket, even if it takes a month. Just start, kick off. Okay, we're gonna move data, we're not sure how to do things. First thing to do is just run it through the internet. And then you'll find a quicker way. My experience is that people that try to find quicker ways, typically the time they take to understand Snowball and to understand the dependencies and to get access to data centers and so forth, is actually longer than the time it takes to move things through the internet. And it's much more complicated. So before deciding on the final strategy to move the data, just start copying immediately. You'll see that most of the time that's more than enough. And then we do the first migration. Let's call it migration 0. On this migration 0, we want to test how our processes work. And then we have disaster recovery. For example, we might have defined on our landing zone what are the regions that we're going to work with. If I have a workload in Europe, maybe I want Frankfurt and Ireland as regions. If I'm in the United States, something else. So deciding which regions I will have disaster recovery, or it can be on the same availability zone, or sorry, another availability zone on the same region. Decide on that, test on that, and do the thing. Just stop the main region or the main workload and work with the second workload. The idea here is to actually test the process of running something on disaster recovery. You don't know how many customers I have seen that have a fantastic mechanism to do disaster recovery, but they have never tested it. So, will it work? We don't know. So, do try this out. Okay. Now we want to go live, and we'll say that we have migrated. This is another interesting topic. You also don't know how many people I've heard saying, we have migrated our workloads. And I ask, and you have disconnected the original workload on-prem? Oh, not yet. Users are still figuring out, trying to see if they use. We're doing things in parallel. And I say, no, you have not migrated, my friend. You have not turned off the switch on the origin. So do turn off that switch to make sure that all processes, all mechanisms, all users have moved. This is the only way for you to be sure. So decommission that, operate. And also try to understand now how to do cost reduction, right sizing. What happens is sometimes we use exactly the same size of machines or the same configuration that we had on-prem, but things work better on cloud. They're faster for the same size, and we think we understand that we can reduce them. Other times, we have seen that some of the processes that work there that are requiring a very heavy machine, when you get from there, then move to open source. So for example, we can port .NET code into .NET Core. .NET Core will allow us to run on Linux. Running on Linux will allow us to reduce the license of the operating system and use things like Graviton, which are processors that are more powerful. We have things like Bubblefish, which are proxies to protocols. Bubblefish will allow a client of SQL Server to query a database that it's on Postgres without knowing that it's Postgres. So you have converted a database to Postgres, but the client still thinks it's Microsoft SQL Server. So these kind of things. And then the database schema conversion, where you can actually convert the protocol of the database. In the case of Samsung, for example, 1.1 billion users on 3 continents. Then they moved it from Oracle to Aurora with this database migration service. It will do the conversion for you when moving from one database to the other. Not everything will work, but it will highlight what are the things that you eventually need to do manually if needed. And with that, they achieved a cost reduction of 44% in terms of database cost. So these are the cost reductions that we're looking for. We then have moving to this horizontal scaling. And typically, what we try to do is focus on the batch jobs. So these batch jobs will spike your compute and your database performance during certain periods, either at night or during the weekend, and you sometimes have to size your environment to those spikes. So if you could remove that spike, you could size everything down. So you want to target those spikes, extract those jobs, and try to run it on things that are horizontally scalable. EC2 spot instance, for example, if you have EC2, or Lambda, completely serverless functions, or containers. You have ECS, you have EKS, and now you have App Runner, which is even easier than ECS. So it's basically complexity of managing. EQS is a bit more complex than ECS, that is a bit more complex than App Runner. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for you to move on this journey. And finally, the last step of the journey is the mental model. And it's probably the hardest one. The mental model is this move from thinking about on-prem mechanisms, and I see that a lot, people that move from on-prem to the cloud, but they still have a mindset of on-prem. They still think as if they were on-prem. This mindset has to change with these sort of paradigms. So we have event-driven architectures, learn about it. You have domain-driven design, learn about it. Event-driven architectures will allow you to think about the distributed architecture. Domain-driven design will allow you to know where to break the distributed architecture and how to break your teams in terms of responsibilities. From there, you can start setting up patterns. You have the Saga pattern. These are long-term transactions. We think that we need to do everything ACID, on atomic, on the databases. We need that transaction in milliseconds. But then we look at Sagas, and we see that the world is actually asynchronous. It's not synchronous. So if we think about the world as systems, applying Saga mechanisms, we can get rid of those gigantic monolithic databases and have objective-driven architecture, objective-driven databases. And finally, we have CQRS, which is a way of reading different from writing that will achieve high levels of performance without using caching and without using, with very low resources. Finally, for moving forward and start breaking the monolith, there is this, the Strangler pattern, and a service on AWS called Refactor Spaces, but now I'm just selling AWS technology. And this Strangler pattern, the idea is for you to think of your new, or of your features as abstracted by an API, and then extract those features to the sides, to their own systems, one by one. You start with a big monolith, and then you start moving things out of the monolith. Some people say that we should start designing systems as distributed systems. I'm not of that opinion. I would say if you are a startup, probably with a small team, think about your team as the number of services that you need to have. If there's only 2 or 3 of you, probably you're better off with a monolith. It's easier. And then when you start growing and segregating your team, start segregating your services accordingly. Don't fall into the trap of micro, nano services, something like that. Okay? Okay, so we've reached the end of our journey, and this is the modernized phase. There's no end to it. You will continue to reinvent yourself. And the takeaway that I would like you to take from here is that migrating and modernizing can be done in only one step, or it can be done in very small steps that you control. It will take longer, but you can do this one step at a time and take this into a higher level, especially if you have a big organization, nationwide, global organization. You need to account for all of these stakeholders and get these steps right. Understand that migrating can be done before modernizing, and you can do, even on modernization, do one thing at a time. From here on, you can meet me on LinkedIn. We can continue to have that conversation. And you can go into these training resources. So 2 QR codes here, links for training on migrations, specifically, so all of the assess, mobilize, and migrate phases. And then on the modernization pathways, where things go a bit in parallel, you can decide what to focus on. If you're focusing on containers or databases, have different journeys on that. So just have fun on that. And that's me, opening up for questions. We have one there.